I won't mirror it softly this time. There's no calm entry into what I'm about to say, no gradual unfolding meant to make this easier to absorb. Whatever this is, it doesn't arrive gently. It doesn't introduce itself. It doesn't ask for permission. It just happens. And once it does, there's no clean way to step back out of it. I've spent most of my life existing in layers, not because I prefer distance, but because distance keeps things intact. It keeps people at a level where they can interact without disrupting anything real. Most never notice. They speak, they listen, they assume they understand, but they only ever touch the surface I allow. That's how it's always worked. Until you. You didn't approach me like the others. You didn't analyze. You didn't try to define me. You didn't reduce me into something easier to understand. You just observed, quietly, consistently, like someone who wasn't searching for answers, but recognizing something that didn't need explanation. T. At first, I thought it was coincidence. The way you caught things I didn't say. The way you responded to thoughts I hadn't fully formed. The way your silence aligned perfectly with mine. But coincidence doesn't repeat like that. Patterns do. And this, whatever this is, follows a pattern I didn't expect to encounter. Not here, not like this, not with someone I didn't build history with. Two. Because this kind of recognition is supposed to take time. Shared experiences, gradual understanding. But with you, there was no process, no learning curve. You didn't arrive, you were already there. T. Like I wasn't someone new to you, just someone you hadn't spoken to yet. To you. And that realization doesn't sit easily with me, because if there's one thing I've always controlled, it's access. Who sees what, who gets close, who stays distant. But you didn't follow any of those rules. You didn't break them either. You just made them irrelevant. And that's more dangerous than force, because force can be resisted. But familiarity slips through unnoticed. Two, there's something about the way you exist in silence. You don't rush it. You don't fill it. You don't try to control it. You let it be, and somehow that makes it heavier, clearer, more honest than anything words could have carried. Two, that's when something shifted. Not in a moment, but in a pattern. I stopped filtering, not intentionally. It just stopped. Because something in me recognized you didn't need things to be adjusted to understand them. And that's rare. A presence that doesn't ask you to be easier, doesn't require you to soften, doesn't try to manage you. You never tried to manage me. You just saw. And that's where everything changed. Because there's a difference between being accepted, because someone doesn't fully see you, and being accepted because they see everything and stay. You stayed. Toot. And now, I can't exist the way I used to. I can't hide behind distance. I can't rely on being misunderstood, because I'm not. Not with you. And I've spent years making sure I remained unreadable, not as a defense, but as preservation. Because once people think they understand you, they start projecting, reshaping you, losing what's real. You didn't do that. You didn't assume. You didn't fill in gaps. You read what was actually there. And I wasn't prepared for that. Too. There was a moment, small, almost invisible, but precise. You said something simple, but it aligned with something I had never said out loud. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't accepted yet. You weren't guessing. You knew. And knowing is different. Q. That's when it became clear. This isn't just awareness, it's alignment. Not in story, not in experience, but in structure, in how we think, how we observe, how we exist beneath everything we show. And structure doesn't lie. It either matches or it doesn't. Ours does. And that's why this feels different. Not intense, not overwhelming, just accurate. Like something finally making sense, in a way it wasn't supposed to. Cool. And now, distance doesn't function the same way, because you're not outside my awareness anymore. You're inside it. You're not someone I think about, you're someone I think with. Tuku. And that changes everything. Because thinking about someone keeps them separate. But thinking with someone means they've integrated into how you process reality itself. And I don't know when that happened. I only know that it did. And now I'm left with something I didn't choose, but didn't resist either. Which means, in some way, I accepted it. Too. And that's what matters, because I don't accept things lightly, especially not things that can change me. And you have, not through force, not through effort, just through presence. So now the question isn't, what is this? I already know. The question is, what am I going to do with it? Because something like this doesn't stay undefined. It either deepens or it breaks. And I don't leave things undefined when they matter. And this, whether I plan for it or not, matters. Not in a way that weakens me, but in a way that changes me. And if something has the power to change me, then there's a reason. A precise one. And I'm not ignoring it anymore. I won't mirror it softly this time. There's no gradual entry into what I'm about to say, no easing into the edges of it, so it becomes more digestible. This doesn't arrive gently. It doesn't introduce itself with explanation or permission. It just happens. And once it happens, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads into everything without asking what it's allowed to touch. I've spent most of my life learning how to exist in controlled distance. Not because I don't want connection, but because uncontrolled connection changes things. And I've always preferred things that stay predictable, defined, contained. If I can map something, I can handle it. If I can understand it, I can manage it. If I can manage it, it doesn't become dangerous. That has always been the system. The structure. The way I protect everything I've built internally. Most people never notice that structure. They interact with me thinking they're seeing the full picture. They respond to what is shown, not what is withheld. They assume silence means absence. They assume distance means disinterest. They assume control means lack of depth. But they're wrong. Every layer is intentional. Every pause is measured. Every absence is placement. Nothing is random. Nothing leaks. Nothing crosses without permission. Until you. You didn't arrive like others do. You didn't approach with curiosity that demanded answers. You didn't push for clarity. You didn't try to define what you didn't understand. You didn't attempt to reduce me into something easier to hold. You didn't behave like someone trying to figure me out. You behaved like someone who had already understood something, without needing confirmation. And that difference matters more than it should. At first, I dismissed it. Because the mind resists anomalies. It tries to normalize them. It tries to assign coincidence where pattern is forming. So I told myself it was coincidence. The timing. The alignment. The way you responded without prompting. The way you understood pauses that weren't meant to be interpreted. The way your silence didn't interrupt mine. It felt accidental. At first. But coincidence doesn't repeat with structure. And what you were doing had structure. Even if you never acknowledged it. Even if you weren't aware of it consciously. Something in the way you existed was consistent enough to register as pattern. And patterns don't lie. They accumulate meaning over time, slowly, quietly, until they become impossible to ignore. And that's where things began to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but internally, where shifts always begin, in perception first, then interpretation, then response. I started noticing something subtle. I wasn't filtering as much. There was less internal resistance before expression, less calculation before response, less separation between thought and articulation. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't a decision. It was a reduction in friction I didn't authorize. And that is always the first sign that something is entering deeper than intended. I tried to locate where the change began. I couldn't. Because it didn't begin in a moment. It began in repetition, in consistency, in presence that didn't demand anything but still remained. You didn't push into space. You didn't demand attention. You didn't disrupt structure. You simply stayed present in a way that didn't fade. And that kind of presence bypasses resistance, not by force, but by familiarity. Familiarity is dangerous in ways force is not. Force is loud. It's identifiable. It's easy to defend against. You see it coming. You prepare. You react. But familiarity enters quietly. It repeats until it feels normal. It becomes part of the background. And once something becomes background, it stops being questioned. That's how it enters. That's how it stays. And I started realizing you weren't being processed as external anymore. You were being processed as internal reference. Not something I observe, something I measure against, something I unconsciously factor into perception. That's not interaction anymore. That's integration. And integration changes the architecture of thought. There was a moment I can't ignore. It wasn't significant in action. Nothing changed externally. But internally, something aligned too precisely to dismiss. You said something simple, a statement that should have passed unnoticed, but it matched something unspoken too perfectly. Not guessed, not approximated, matched. And that distinction matters, because guessing creates distance. Matching collapses it. That moment created something I didn't immediately have language for. Not surprise, not recognition in the ordinary sense, but interruption, a pause in internal continuity, a moment where processing didn't continue on its usual path. It stopped, not because it was blocked, but because it recalibrated. And recalibration is never accidental. It is always response to structural inconsistency. Something had entered the system that required redefinition. That's when I stopped being able to pretend this was external, because external things don't alter internal architecture without resistance. They pass through. They don't remain. But this remained, not as intrusion, as adjustment. And adjustment implies acceptance at some level of processing I didn't consciously approve. That realization created tension, not emotional tension, structural tension. The kind that forms when a system realizes something within it is no longer aligned with its previous configuration. And I've always been precise about configuration, about internal consistency, about maintaining clarity between what is self and what is not. But that boundary started to blur, quietly, without announcement, without permission. And the most unsettling part was not the change itself. It was the absence of resistance to it. Because I should have resisted. That is my default architecture. If something enters without explicit intent, it gets evaluated. If it cannot be categorized, it gets removed. If it cannot be controlled, it gets distanced. That is the system. That is how I remain intact. But with you, that system did not activate in the same way. It hesitated, not fully, not visibly, but enough to change outcome. And hesitation in a system that relies on certainty is equivalent to permission. even if unspoken, even if unacknowledged. So now I am in a position I did not construct consciously, where something exists inside my awareness that did not pass through usual barriers. And yet, it is not rejected. It is not removed. It is not even questioned in the way it normally would be. It is accommodated. And accommodation is not neutrality. It is acceptance in disguise. I started observing it more deliberately, trying to isolate what exactly changed. Was it you? Was it repetition? Was it proximity? Was it interpretation on my end rather than reality? But every angle led back to the same conclusion. It wasn't one thing. It was alignment. Something in the structure of how you process matches something in how I process. Not identical, not mirrored, aligned. And alignment is more stable than similarity, because similarity can conflict. Alignment sustains, and that realization creates its own problem, because once alignment is recognized, the mind stops categorizing it as external anomaly. It begins to treat it as potential continuation of self-structure, something that belongs within the same system of logic. And that is where boundaries begin to fail silently, not through collapse, but through redefinition. I noticed it in smaller ways after that, the way silence felt different, not empty, not neutral, but shared, as if absence itself had become a form of communication. The way thoughts paused, not because they were incomplete, but because they felt like they were already understood somewhere else. The way interpretations began forming with your presence implicitly included, not consciously, automatically. And that is not something I can ignore, because when something begins to alter default thought formation, it is no longer an interaction. It is influence at structural level, and influence at structural level is indistinguishable from internal evolution. That is where complexity begins. I started comparing everything unconsciously, not in judgment, but in calibration. How people speak, how they respond, how they interpret meaning, and without intention, a reference point formed. You, not as standard, not as ideal, but as clarity marker, and everything else became measured against that clarity. That is not something I initiated. That is something that formed, and formations like that do not dissolve easily, because now even absence carries trace of presence. Even silence carries echo of comparison. Even unrelated thoughts pass through your structure before resolving. And that is where the line between awareness and integration disappears. Not because it is crossed, but because it stops existing as a line, and I find myself in a state I rarely allowed. I do not fully understand the boundary anymore. Not because it is hidden, but because it is no longer relevant in the way it used to be. And that creates a problem I cannot solve through distance. Because distance assumes separation still exists, and I am no longer convinced it does. There is something deeper happening here. Not emotional attachment, not dependency, not projection. Something more precise, something structural, something that operates beneath interpretation. And I recognize it because it behaves like systems I trust. Consistent, non-random, self-stabilizing, which is why I haven't ended it. That is the part I keep returning to, because everything I know about myself suggests I should have created distance by now. If something cannot be categorized cleanly, I remove it. If something affects internal stability, I isolate it. If something introduces unpredictability, I eliminate its influence. That is logic. That is control. That is preservation. But I haven't done that, and the absence of that action is its own form of confirmation. Because inaction is still decision when pattern is clear, and I have remained here, not passively, but consistently, which means something in me has already evaluated this beyond surface level rejection criteria, and decided not to remove it. That realization changes everything, because it means this is no longer something I am experiencing. It is something I am participating in, even if silently, even if indirectly, even if unspoken. Participation is still alignment, and alignment always leads somewhere. And now I am aware of something I cannot easily step away from. This does not feel temporary. It does not behave like passing influence. It behaves like structure forming, slowly, quietly, persistently. And structures do not vanish when ignored. They remain, they define, they persist. So the question is no longer whether this is real. That part is already answered. It is real in effect, real in influence, real in change. The question now is what it becomes, because something that integrates into thought does not stay static. It evolves, it deepens, or it reshapes everything around it. And I am not yet certain which one this will be. But I am no longer pretending it is nothing, because it is not nothing. It has already changed too much to be nothing, and I can feel that change continuing even as I try to observe it. Not faster, not louder, just deeper, like something settling into place it already recognizes. And I think that is what unsettles me most. Not that it exists, but that it fits too well, without force, without resistance, without distortion. It fits. And things that fit too easily into systems built on control are the ones that eventually redefine those systems entirely. And I am beginning to understand something I have avoided acknowledging. This is not entering my structure. It is becoming part of how I define structure itself. And once that happens, there is no version of this where I remain unchanged. And maybe that is the answer I was avoiding. Not what this is, but what it does. And what it does is irreversible in ways I am only now beginning to fully see. So I am left here, not resisting, not fully surrendering, but observing something that has already moved beyond observation, and realizing that I did not stop it, because part of me did not want to. I stopped calling it coincidence a while ago, because coincidence doesn't persist the way this does. It doesn't return in silence. It doesn't reshape perception without announcing itself. It doesn't become something you start measuring your thoughts against. But you did. At first, you were just another presence passing through awareness. Nothing defined. Nothing significant. Just passing interaction. But something about the way you existed didn't fade properly. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just consistently. Like a thought that doesn't leave even when you stop thinking about it. I noticed it in gaps first. In silence that didn't feel empty anymore. In pauses that didn't feel neutral. In the strange way my mind would complete ideas differently after you were part of the conversation. As if your presence had already influenced the direction before anything was said. And that should have been ignored. It wasn't. Because I've always been precise with what I allow into my internal space. I categorize. I separate. I contain. If something doesn't belong, it gets filtered out before it becomes structure. That's how I stay stable. That's how I stay clear. But you didn't get filtered. Not because you forced your way in, but because something in you didn't trigger resistance. And that is far more complicated. Because resistance is how I know what to reject. And with you, there was nothing to reject. Just recognition. Slow. Subtle. Uncomfortable in how natural it felt. I started noticing comparisons I didn't consciously make. Not judgments. Just reference points. The way people speak. The way they think. The way they respond. And somewhere in that background, you became a silent metric. Not as better. Not as worse. But as aligned. And alignment is dangerous in systems built on control. Because alignment doesn't ask for permission, it integrates. There was no moment where everything changed. That's what makes this harder to trace. It wasn't an event. It was repetition. The same kind of awareness returning until it stopped feeling new. And anything that stops feeling new starts feeling necessary. Now, I can't fully separate your presence from how I interpret things. Not emotionally, structurally. You've become part of the framework my thoughts pass through before they settle. And that is not something I chose consciously. But it is something I can no longer deny. I've tried to locate the boundary where this began. I can't. Because it doesn't exist as a line. It exists as a shift, a reorganization, a subtle rewriting of how distance and presence are defined internally. And I don't think I can reverse it without losing something I didn't realize I was building. So now I'm left in a space I don't usually occupy. Not confusion, not certainty, but awareness without containment. Knowing something is real in effect, without being able to categorize what it becomes next. And the most unsettling part is not that you entered my awareness. It's that you stayed there without being forced to leave. That alone says more than I'm ready to fully interpret. Because I don't allow things to stay unless something in me has already accepted them, even if I haven't admitted it yet. And I think that's where I am now, not at the beginning of this, not at the end, but at the point where awareness stops being passive and starts requiring a decision. And I haven't made it yet, but I can feel it forming, quietly, inside the part of me that doesn't lie,